Pauline's got her wacky narrative which appeals to a certain segment of the voters. What we tend to overlook is that international education is Victoria's number one industry. It's South Australia's number one industry. It's in the top 5 in New South Wales and in Queensland.
Immigration. It's a hot button issue in Australia at the moment. One Nation's Pauline Hanson has described foreign student arrivals as unsustainable and a backdoor to mass immigration. Andrew Hastie and Jacinta Price have gone to the opposition backbench after expressing their concerns. But today we hear from the other side of the debate, the education sector, who rely on foreign students. Welcome to this week's edition of The Issue. We're speaking to Phil Honeywood. He's a former minister in the Kennett government of Victoria, a Liberal Premier. He served there in the multicultural affairs portfolio and in international education. It's a sector that's dominated his working life. Phil now works for the International Education Association of Australia. Today we're talking to him about a hot topic, immigration and international students. And for his sake, we're now joined by Phil Honeywood. Phil, thanks for joining me. And a fascinating career you've had. Tell me about it. Well,
look, international education, Josh, has been my whole life journey from when I was a one-year exchange student in Tokyo, Japan, in the late 1970s, to going to ANU and doing what you now call an international relations degree, but back then we called it an honours degree in political science, working for Shell Oil Company and then being elected to Parliament. And I was very fortunate as the youngest minister in Jeff Kennett's government, 32 at the time, to get the multicultural affairs and higher education and training portfolios. And that meant that I was exposed yet again to more internationalisation with all the migrant communities in Melbourne, with lots of international travel on behalf of the Kennett government. And as a politician, it's always good to plan your own exit strategy rather than be exited by the voters. And so after 18 years in Parliament, including Deputy Leader of the Parliamentary Liberal Party, I decided it was time to have a clean break, and I chose to work in international education. And I've had the current position as CEO of Australia's national peak body in international education since 2011. So, it's kind of like my lifetime story.
Former Premier Kennett's a pretty well-known figure, still appears in the media. What would you say you learnt from working alongside him in his government?
Well, Jeff had a reputation for being hard-nosed, conservative, and yet the irony was that his first ministry as a young minister originally himself was multicultural affairs. And so he actually had quite a genuine love and support for migrant communities in Victoria and Australia. We were the first government to stand up to Pauline Hanson when she hit the national stage, and we had a front page editorial back then in the Age newspaper critiquing what Pauline Hanson's sort of racist concepts were at the time. And so, Jeff was very supportive of sensible migration, of integrating migrants into the Australian community, but supporting their desire to retain some of their culture at the same time.
Pauline Hanson's still making headlines today. She's, said that the number of international students is too high, migration is too high, and it seems she's getting a lot of popularity in the polls at the moment. She's up as high as 18% according to some. Do you agree with her, or do you think she's still got it wrong?
Look, I think Pauline's got her wacky narrative which appeals to a certain segment of the voters. What we tend to overlook is that international education is Victoria's number one industry. It's South Australia's number one industry. It's in the top 5 in New South Wales and in Queensland. And for a state like Victoria, where we don't have mineral wealth, we're very reliant on our world-class universities really being able to attract international students who pay around 3 times more in tuition fees for the same degree that an Australian student would pay for. And when they're here, they need entertainment, food, they work in part-time jobs that many young Australians, Josh, wouldn't even think to work in, commercial office cleaning at night, 7-Elevens, petrol stations, in order to supplement the money they get from home. What's not understood is more than 70% actually go home at their end of their education in Australia. And if they've had a good experience here, they become lifetime ambassadors for Australia. And often they invest in Australia, bring their kids back later on. So we really do benefit. In fact, over 1/3 of the tourism that comes into Australia each year is friends and family of international students, either coming out for graduation, coming to visit their son or daughter, or even after they've graduated themselves, coming back for visits. So there's incredible spin-offs, and that's why the Australian Bureau of Statistics maintains that international education is worth around $45 billion a year to the Australian economy. And they carve that up as 40% in the high tuition fees that they pay for an Australian qualification, and the remainder 60% for the cost of living in Australia.
It's not just one nation, I guess, at the moment. Even the Labor government has made things more restrictive, and the latest figures for midway through last year show a 16% drop in the number of annual intake of international students. What's happening there? Why is that happening?
Well, unfortunately, the Morrison government, when they closed Australian borders and told international students to go home, they realised that they didn't have the labour force to wash dishes in restaurants, to do a lot of the jobs that I mentioned young Australians would no longer do. And so under pressure from the hospitality industry, from tourism bodies, etc., they then opened Australia up, coming out of the pandemic. But what they did was they allowed uncapped work rights. So you could come as an international student, allegedly study full-time, but you're allowed to work 100 hours a week or more if you wanted. And that led to a whole cohort of non-genuine students, particularly out of the subcontinent, coming to Australia for the wrong reasons, to make Australian dollars to send back home to the struggling family business back in India, Nepal, wherever. And we got really a flood of non-genuine students because of that Morrison government unlimited work right issue. Now, like every other study destination country, Canada, UK, America, we allow international students to work part-time while they study and help them supplement their cost of living, which every other country allows. But to allow them unlimited work rights meant that we got a flood of young people into the country for all the wrong reasons. And many of them are hanging around. And to the credit of the Albanese government, they've brought back in a limit on how many hours a week a student can work while they study full-time. And they've also moved to try and get that backlog of young people who've stayed in Australia, in many cases illegally, in other cases by deferring various visa situations. And they're trying to get some common sense outcomes.
The cost of visas has gone up as well, I think as high as now $2,000. Is that a move you agree with, or has that also seen a drop in students?
Look, there's no doubt that because Australia now has the world's highest non-refundable student visa application fee, that we're taking a big hit. We're taking a big hit particularly from Latin America, where a lot of Latin American students will come and study English language at an Australian English language college for 25 weeks, 30 weeks. And we've seen a massive drop in English language. It's down by more than 50% or more in terms of applications just to come and study English. In equal measure for vocational qualifications, be it plumbing or hospitality, marketing diplomas, that's also taken a big hit. So it's really become now a higher education market. But $2,000 non-refundable just to apply to come to Australia is 3 times more than what you'd pay for the same type of application to go to Canada or to the UK. And it's definitely a deterrent, particularly for young people wanting to come into a short-term certificate or diploma level course, which they've done in the past.
So would you like to see the fee lowered or become refundable?
Yeah, look, my association, along with other industry bodies, stakeholders, have argued very strongly with Jason Clare and Julian Hill, the Assistant Minister of International Education, that we need to have a common sense outcome here. We need to bring the cost down by half for short-term, under 12-month programs, particularly English language. I mean, the government want us to diversify away from China, India, Nepal, the 3 main countries that we get students from, but we can't get Latin American students because it's much cheaper to go to Canada or UK, then we're shooting ourselves in the foot in terms of that diversification target of the government.
Why do they want that diversity?
Well, because any country, you don't want students just coming primarily from one or two other nations. You want, in the classroom, you want to see a whole United Nations if you can. And having United Nations in the classroom is also good for young Australian students because they learn other cultures, other languages. They get more what we call global citizenship outlook, which I think is a really good thing, for particularly in the context of the Hanson debate. We want more global citizens, outward looking, rather than just inward looking only.
Where has been hit hardest by the reduction in student numbers? Are the regional universities feeling it?
Look, regional universities have always felt the pain because we're an urbanised country. Young people from overseas, they love the bright lights of Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane. They want that urban experience, and attracting them to Bathurst, to other regional communities, it's very challenging. Also, they're not quite sure they've got a part-time job while they study in a regional community. However, the government have given incentives. They've given a fairish share of enrolment numbers to the regional unis, and that's beginning to bear fruit. Crucially, I think we need to educate international students that if they go and study in a region, they'll actually be very warmly accepted. We've found some incredible examples of regional communities that have really embraced international students who then become migrants, and there are more incentives now to become a migrant from education in a regional community, notwithstanding that over 70% of our international students return to their home country.
So are there any other incentives you'd like to see the government do to attract international students to the regions, and not just incentives but also maybe marketing as well?
Yes, I think it's high time we had a targeted migration, or not migration, but certainly a marketing campaign which highlighted the benefits of studying, living. It's often much cheaper, obviously, to live in a regional community than it is in the big CBD areas. And the government could do some heavy lifting there to try and encourage more regional community focus. Bear in mind, of course, that many of these young people do come from regional communities themselves, so they understand the benefits of living in that type of environment.
Are regional universities having to close down student accommodation or some buildings because of a reduction in students?
No, we're finding there's still strong demand for on-campus or near-campus accommodation. That's definitely ramping up in Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane, with very big student accommodation companies owned by overseas pension funds, in most cases, who are building apartment towers. Companies like Scape, Igloo, Unilodge, you'll see their apartment towers close to every university in the big cities. The cost benefit for these companies to build smaller facilities in regional communities is not quite there. And again, often there's no financial incentive from government for them to do so in regional communities.
On housing, Liberal backbencher Andrew Hastie has cited housing as one of the reasons why he wants to see a cut in immigration and international students. Is he wrong? Do you have any evidence that students aren't taking up accommodation that would be going to Australian families?
Well, as I said, we've had an incredible boom in purpose-built student accommodation, apartment towers all over the big cities, and they're taking up a lot of the demand that's there from international students. They're catered primarily for international students at the price point. But look, there's many reasons as to why we've got a housing shortage in Australia, and I think what the Liberal Party need to focus on is that Dan Tehan signed a free trade agreement with the UK, which has allowed unlimited numbers of young British backpackers now to come into Australia. I understand there's been more than a doubling of UK young people alone in the last 12 months coming to Australia on working holiday visas. Now, they don't pay $1 to study at any of our education institutions. They're not paying for English language tuition all they're doing is having a good time. They're here for a good time, and they're taking up a lot of the part-time jobs that international students would normally be offered, and they go home after 3 years. And they used to be required, before this free trade agreement that Dan Tehan signed as Trade Minister, they used to be required to work 80 days or so every year on a farm. That's been wiped as well. So we're now finding that there's been a massive increase in backpackers coming to Australia. My industry would rather see international students from our own region, the Asia Pacific, paying for a world-class qualification and being warmly welcomed here, and thereby adding to our economy, rather than just having these backpackers here for a good time and not adding anything to our economy before they go back home.
So do you want to see the government or the opposition revisit that free trade deal, or is that too far gone, or are there other measures that could get the outcome you're looking for?
Yeah, look, before, Josh, we start talking about capping international student numbers, which effectively there already is now a cap on the numbers who can come and study here, let's look at some of the other problems in the net overseas migration number, which includes backpackers and that massive increase. And I think we need to look at some sort of cap from all countries on these visa types that really are disrupting the net overseas migration figure, and they're making it look as though all these people are coming to Australia and staying here, when in fact the reality is they're not. And international students are an easy target, but as I say, they're willing to do the jobs that young Australians will no longer do. And isn't it far better that we're educating young people from our own region? I'm not talking about UK here or Europe, but we're educating young people from all over Southeast Asia, from the subcontinent, from China. We're teaching them what a Western democratic society values are before they go home, and they're taking with them a world-class qualification. And for Australia's soft power diplomacy, what's better? Temporary backpackers from the UK, or actually providing young people from our own region with a world-class qualification where they'll go home and think of Australia in a really good way for their future lives.
So would you say international education could be used in that battle with China for influence in the Indo-Pacific?
Look, I'm not going to target any specific country. Obviously, we're also in a global skills race where we're not producing enough young Australians doing IT, allied health, engineering. So we're in a global skills race with many countries, and China's one of them. So, yeah, I think it's in our own interest going forward that we appreciate the nuances of the skills that we need in the economy. We appreciate also that some of the skills that our neighbouring countries in Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, etc., and the Pacific, the skills that they need, and we are willing to and able to deliver those skills for their young people, either to attract talent to Australia in those skill areas that we really desperately have a skill shortage in, or to provide those skills to the countries for their own future.
We understand the coalition's about to implement or roll out their new migration policy, which could include a language and values test. Are you worried that would be applied against students looking to come here to learn English?
Look, fair enough. If they want to increase the migration test to actually get permanent residence in Australia, that's one thing. But international students are only here for a short term. So say over 70% of them go home, have to go home, apart from the ones we try and keep here for those health, IT, engineering shortages that I mentioned before. So provided the coalition limit their, if you like, their focus on migration versus international students' short-term study experience, then I've got no opposition to that.
Are our universities right now competitive? Are you worried about the future? How bleak is the situation? How would you assess it?
Unfortunately, there's been a devil's compact for many years in Australia between both coalition and Labor governments, where they've been happy to turn a blind eye to the fact that international students make up a big part of every university's revenue. And the reason for that is that no Australian government has funded our public universities at anything like the OECD average for many, many years. So we've really let down our higher education sector by really keeping them on the drip feed. And understandably, our universities, if they want to build a new building, if they want to try and go into world-class research, costly research academic endeavour, then they need to supplement their revenue. So that Devil's Compact, I think, is still there to a large extent. The current Labor government are not funding our universities at OECD average. And on that basis, what we have to do is appreciate that international students really are a key component of any university's annual revenue inputs. And we need to also understand that some of the universities are now doing it much harder than they were a few years ago because of the, we don't call it a cap, because of the enrolment limits that have been placed on every university to bring international students into the country. Having said that, I would have to say that Australia is in the least worst situation because Donald Trump's America, Canada as well, UK are all effectively limiting now the number of young people from overseas who can come and study at their universities. So I think the Albanese government's in a sweet spot insofar as we've got the world's highest visa fees, we're limiting the students who can come here, and yet there's still incredible demand from around the world.
6 or 7 years ago, there were concerns about foreign influence at unis, particularly the Confucius Institutes. We saw an incident at the University of Queensland where Drew Pavlo, a student, was attacked by Chinese students. A lot of those institutes have closed down. It seems like the influence is less. Is that a good thing, maybe, that there's more clearer lines between foreign influence and universities?
I think every Australian worries if a foreign country has too much interference or involvement in compromising our own culture, our own values. And obviously governments have had to act to ensure that there's more transparency around what happens. In all of that, we have to appreciate that particularly students from China make up an incredible proportion of our research output in Australia, particularly in areas such as IT and engineering, where, as I said before, we don't have enough young Australians going into STEM programs. So we often do need to bulk up our crucial research project teams with overseas students. And we've got to be really careful we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater there in terms of not accepting students from a particular country because we might think that somehow or other their cultural values will impede our situation. So there's a fine line to be drawn. Every country, I mean, at the moment, France and Germany, who've never really brought in many overseas students, are bringing in tens of thousands of Chinese students into their economies, into their universities, because of this research deficiency that we're happening in Australia.
How can the government get Australians excited about STEM or IT, do you think?
I think we have to blame it on the parents, really. I think, unfortunately, 2 generations of parents have wanted their kids to go to uni, have encouraged their kids to get involved in the creative arts, to get involved in open thinking, whatever you want to call it. And really the focus in our primary schools and our high schools has not been on mathematics, on science. They seem to be too difficult, they seem to be boring compared to oral expression, creative arts, whatever. And we've just not really been up to the mark on global terms. That's been proven every year with global benchmarking results for our primary schools and our high schools. And there's no easy answer. I mean, STEM graduates in Australia are offered very competitive salaries. They can quite easily, compared to other qualifications, get good paying jobs. So how do you motivate? It's the $15 billion question.
Yeah, I have a couple of friends who work for Canva or AirwallX, which is Australian success stories in IT, doing quite well financially. I guess maybe selling that story more.
I think there's definitely scope to have a education campaign, but you'd have to really get into the primary schools, into the high schools with that education campaign, because as we know, once a young person decides to drop chemistry, drop physics, whatever, and do low-level maths, or like me, do no mathematics at all, then you finish up with no feeder program into the university.
The other part of your job is attracting Australian students overseas. Are Australians still going abroad to study in big numbers? What are you seeing there?
Look, we had an incredible problem during the pandemic, obviously, when it was just impossible to have young Australians study overseas. We're now finding through this wonderful scholarship program which Julie Bishop brought in many years ago called the New Colombo Plan, we're now finding that there's an appetite for young Australians to do both short-term study, like 4 weeks or so, or even a semester abroad. And that's really important because a lot of Southeast Asian countries have complained in the past that all Australia does is make money out of their young people by bringing them to Australia. Why aren't there any young Australians on their university campuses? And so we've now got more than 20,000 young Australians a year going and studying abroad, particularly under that New Colombo Plan Australian Government Scholarship Program. And that's a good thing because it shows our Asian neighbours that we're willing to have young Australians enjoy their Asian cultural and education experience. What we're also finding now is that the Albanese government have incentivised our universities to get exemptions from their enrolment limits in Australia if they partner with overseas unis. And I've just come back from India with Education Minister Jason Clare, where we opened a number of offshore Australian university campuses in that country. We're doing the same in Vietnam, we're doing it in Thailand and in China. And that's got to be a good thing, to take a world-class Australian qualification into another country.
Phil, are you concerned your sector's losing the publicity battle? Andrew Hastie, it's been reported, as crowdfunded nearly $250,000 for an advertising campaign on immigration. Some of the latest news polls show a 2/3 support for cutting immigration. Are you concerned, or are you looking at launching a campaign?
Yes, we are talking to the universities at the moment about having a public relations campaign to really highlight that Australia benefits, that under the caption of international students help Australia thrive, to try and, counter some of this incredible race to the bottom, knee-jerk sort of anti-migration narrative, particularly given, as I said, that more than 70% of these international students return home anyway after they finish studying. So I think we need to counter that wrong narrative that certain politicians would like to trade off. But I genuinely believe that most Australians see through racism, most Australians see through attack on migrants, particularly given that we are a country that's been built on migration over many, many years.
What would you say to Australians that are concerned that they can't afford a house, or maybe that the culture's changed because of immigration?
We have to separate immigration out from temporary international students coming here to get a world-class qualification and go home. There's obviously a rental issue, but our industry has really lifted its game in terms of providing for more purpose-built student accommodation with tens of thousands of new international student beds coming onto the market as we speak. So it's not international students that should be blamed for any rental increases. In fact, you'll often find international students are the ones that are willing to live at the end of the railway lines in a shared house with 3 or 4 others because of their own cost of living constraints. So we need to really, I think, highlight that there's a difference between migration and international students.
Phil Honeywood, thanks for joining The Issue. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Josh.
This has been The Issue from 7 News. You can listen to us as a podcast, watch on YouTube, or catch some of the sharpest comments on 7 News. Follow us where you can, and join us next time for a new issue and a new guest to unravel the answers for us. Till then, all the best.